Hello, BookTube. Recently, I did a video in which one of the books that I talked about was this, The Viking Wars of Alfred the Great by Paul Hill. I mentioned that I consider it to be really good military history the way it should be done, where the author is not just repeating things, but investigating, thinking about how we know what we know about the past. And then I moved on, innocently. And one of you suggested an Alfred the Great starter kit. And my first reaction was, surely that's too wonky, even for this channel. But the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to do it. This is a fascinating figure for me in history. I did, when I was doing Your Daily Penguin, that series, I did one on Penguin Classics, Alfred the Great. So I thought I would put together an Alfred the Great starter kit. I know there are a lot of bigger, more broad interest starter kits that we could do. Maybe this will be a kick in the pants for me to do them. But we're going to start right where I showed you. We're going to start with the Penguin Classic of Alfred the Great, which has not only a whole bunch of other writings from the time of Alfred the Great, but also the life of Alfred by a man named Asser, Bishop Asser, who knew the king, was present, and was doing his best to write what embryonically we might consider biography. It's wildly different, but it's. I bet if we were able to bring Asser forward in time and translate accurately and acclimate him and sit him down and ask him what his goals were for his book, it wouldn't be all that different from what we think of as responsible biography, which makes this invaluable. It makes it an absolutely invaluable. Think of all the figures in history that we wish we had that for. And this volume, this Penguin Classic volume, also covers a lot of other stuff. We are comparatively blessed for primary sources when it comes to Alfred the Great. We have Asser's book. We have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which we'll be getting to. And also, Alfred wrote a lot of stuff himself. He valued learning in a way that his brothers, all of whom had been king before him, did not. In a way that a lot of his subjects did not. He was, even through a glass darkly, a fascinating figure, a genuinely intriguing, complicated person who came to the kingship in 871, ruled until 899, at a time of incredible danger for what we now know as England, which was a whole collection of major kingdoms and minor kingdoms. Alfred came to the throne of one of those major kingdoms at a time when all of England looked to be a playground and vassalage for the Vikings. And Alfred had to deal with that. Somehow, he had to deal with that. He wasn't willing to be a vassal servant of the Vikings. Stop it, baby girl. Stop it. And this book, it does the Penguin Classic thing. It gives you a really good introduction, and then very good translations of a lot of stuff. We have letters to and from Alfred. We have his will. He did a lot of translations of works. He was a reader. He was a big reader. He loved The Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, for instance. Probably loved Bede, the Venerable Bede, and did a bunch of translating from those and the Bible in ways that are interesting. So this gives you a large chunk of that. It's an excellent place to start for Alfred the Great. Then on our starter kit, we're going to have to go in a couple of different directions, as history's treatment of Alfred went in a couple of different directions, sometimes blending. The two different directions, of course, with any great figure in history, are going to be legend and biography. And you can see how those will blur. Even in Asser's book, they blur. And they tell interesting things. Either one, no matter how they're blurring, they tell interesting things about the England in which they were written. So if we go back centuries here. I could not find this on Project Gutenberg, and it certainly does not have a popular edition. I do not mean to put on a starter kit any book that is going to cost you $15,000. Maybe it's on Project Gutenberg, which, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, that's an online repository of ebooks of works that are in the common domain. And I'm positive that this is in the common domain. It could not possibly have copyright. This is Sir John Spellman wrote an early biography, an early modern biography of King Alfred called The Life of Alfred the Great. I just found this old frontispiece. This book would probably, this particular thing would probably cost you quite a bit of money. But I have to believe that there are free reprints of Spellman out there. And he wrote this exemplary life of an exemplary king for the instruction, the moral and political instruction of a different king who was not exemplary. And I don't think it took, but it's fascinating to see what we know of Alfred strained through that moralizing lens. It would probably have been an approach, much though we don't like the thought, it would probably have been an approach that Alfred himself would have liked. Although, reading about Alfred, you really don't get the impression he was an egomaniac. But he probably thought that he was leading a worthwhile life. Certainly he was concerned with the morals of his subjects. He was concerned with their moral life, which is none of the effing business of a ruler. He was anyway. But I mentioned that we're comparatively lucky when it comes to Alfred's own time, to primary documents. We have nothing like the wealth of primary documents for Alfred. That we have nothing like those primary documents for his brothers, for instance, or his father. Probably led very interesting lives, but with Alfred we have a wealth of documentation, comparatively speaking. We have Asser's life. We also have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, as I mentioned, which was annalistic, so it wasn't a narrative. Still fascinating to read, but if, for instance, you were to pick up an old Everyman's hardcover, about 100 years ago, Everyman Library did an Anglo-Saxon Chronicle version. I think they did it in 2 volumes. And it just reprints the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, just entry by entry by entry, with precious little in the way of supporting material. And you want the supporting material. But the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is very much worth reading. There's not anything quite like it out there. You want a good annotated edition. And for that, I chose this. Michael Swanton's annotated edition of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Probably available, probably. And really good. This does exactly what you want an annotated version of an older work to do. It gives you a situating introduction, gives you all the notes, all the entries with all the notes that you need for them. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is fascinating for a whole bunch of reasons that don't have anything to do with Alfred the Great. But it's crucial to read when you're reading about him. And then, so we're going to wobble a little here between biographical treatments, like Spellman's, and historical treatments. We're going to wobble back to a biographical treatment. I'm going to say biographical treatment here, although it's a biography. It's just all biographies partake of their time in one way or another. Somehow they do. All of them partake of the idiosyncrasies of the biographer. This is a historian and biographer, an editor, fantastic, indefatigable correspondent, whose letters I don't believe have ever been collected. This is Beatrice Lees, and this is her biography of Alfred the Great. I found this cover online when I looked for her, so I assume there is at least one version that is gettable. She led a fascinating life. I'm almost tempted here, as I so often am, to recommend not so much her biography of Alfred the Great as somebody's biography of her, but I'd be willing to bet there aren't any biographies of her. Anyway, this is delightful. It's very different from the Spellman. It's not meant to be quite so directly moralizing. Spellman wrote his book as a moral exemplar of one king to another king. This is written at a different time than that. It's still going to be moralizing because Alfred is so tempting in that way, but not quite so directly, not quite so one-on-one. And when we come to moralizing, this brings up this next author. He used to be in vogue. He used to be extremely popular. He is not anymore. He wrote an enormous amount. Most people only know him now from one thing that he wrote. The author is C.K. Chesterton. And if you, in 2023, chances are that if you know him at all, you know him from his Father Brown murder mysteries. But he wrote a lot on a lot of subjects. And he's a really good prose stylist. Although, with the particular book we're talking about right now, we're not talking about prose. Because, much like John Milton, who came to his senses before he tried it, Chesterton thought that the great English subjects deserved epic poems. Which is a daft idea, but it's not as daft an idea as the next one that he had, which was that he could do that. So he wrote The Ballad of the White Horse, an epic poem about Alfred the Great. and believe it or not, it is worth reading. I don't know how it exists anymore. I'm assuming that it's out of copyright, so you could get a free copy. I didn't look on Project Gutenberg for all of these older things. I probably should have done it for Chesterton. This will strain your patience, as most relatively modern epic poems tend to do. This will strain your patience. It's not given to many people to write any kind of an epic poem in the modern light of day and have it not seem laughable and anachronistic. For instance, Lord Tennyson did. But Chesterton, you're not going to be convinced by the epic poetry-ness of this epic poem, but I bet you'll find a lot of it interesting. He really couldn't not be interesting. Then we've got, we'll go back to a biography. We'll do a modern biography here that, looks right over his shoulder at Chesterton. This is Benjamin Merkel's book, The White Horse King, which is very vivid narrative biography. This is not, well, I don't want to say dry, because scholarly biographies aren't always dry. They're not dry if their author knows what he's doing. But this is very much of a different vein. I think you probably, if you read biographies, probably know what I mean. But the kinds of biographies that are really gripping narratives are often bad. They're gripping narratives, yes, but they're bad as biographies, and this is not. So if that's your way into a subject, with the starter kit, I always try to give multiple ways into a subject. If your way into the subject is to read a really accessible biography, well, then this is the one for you. Absolutely. It's not the only biography on this list. Then we'll wobble back to fiction. We'll move forward in time. Another great historical novelist who is not remembered anymore. He wrote a lot of books. They're all fantastic. But even in the sort of make-weight Goodreads best historical novelist list, he is forgotten. No one knows about him anymore. His name was Alfred Duggan. And he wrote a book on Alfred the Great that we've seen on this channel, The Right Line of Certain. Alfred did not look like that, and the cover is wrong as well. But here it would be not so much a question of the cover as it would be that Duggan is fantastic. He's a fantastic writer. He's unjustly forgotten, and he recognized first-rate material when he saw it. Alfred's story is first-rate fictional material. It's got everything that you want. Alfred was an underdog, not just in his own family as a sort of a weakling younger brother, but also in his reign. The Vikings looked unbeatable until Alfred took a step back in a way that a bruiser would not do, and actually thought, well, they look unbeatable, and I'll make my terms with them, and I'll talk to them, and I will never believe a word of what I'm saying. My goal is not to make peace with them. My goal is to get them out of my kingdom permanently. I'll do all of that, but while I'm doing all of that, I'm going to take a cold, hard look at what I need to beat these people. What do I need in order to beat these people? They're not coming in steady, concerted waves. They're making raids, here and there, somewhat unpredictable, which probably means that I need a decentralized defense force. I need defense nodules all over my kingdom that can respond at the slightest bit of trouble, and that are garrisoned and controlled in order to do that. Instead of being caught constantly with their britches down, I certainly need that. Also, these people, these Vikings, they are fierce. They throw axes like nobody's business. But they're just men. Except on the ocean. Except on the rivers. Except on water. On water, they beat us. That doesn't have to stay true. If I could beat them on the water, I can beat them, provided I have all the other systems in place. He sat back and thought about how to win the long-term war, which is something his brothers would not have done. This book captures a lot of the inner aspects of the man. Now, if you want the outer aspects of the man, sometimes with historical fiction, it's really interesting. If somebody writes a historical novel about a great figure, seen through the eyes of someone else, seen through the eyes of a minor figure or a figure that's entirely fictitious. That was done, for instance, with another one of history's the greats. Mary Renault did it in The Persian Boy by not so much telling us Alexander the Great's story as showing us what Alexander the Great looks like through the eyes of a witness who is not, a doer and a shaker at Alexander's court. And Bernard Cornwell had the idea to do that, and did that starting with The Last Kingdom. He gives us Uhtred, son of Uhtred, who is a big bear-like bruiser, who is eventually brought into the service of Alfred the Great and sees him and watches him. And this series goes on, and it wanders away. It concentrates more on Uhtred and his merry men. You won't mind that. If once you fall under the spell of the series, you won't mind that at all. But this book is a good example of the other thing that I'm talking about, where a character encounters our main character, and we get to see them in different aspects because of that. And we'll wobble back to biography here. I mentioned that the White Horse King is kind of gripping, visual, narrative biography. And I contrasted it with scholarly biography that would have the potential to be a little bit drier. Not all of it is. I know I'll make a more concerted case for this with Nonfiction November, but even now I can say you shouldn't be completely, just as a class, scared off by big scholarly biographies of anything. If the biographer knows what they're doing, they will still craft a narrative. And that is true in this case. The author here is Alfred Smith, and this is King Alfred the Great, his biography, Alfred the Great. A big fat thing. I think this was in the Yale English Monarch series or the University of California English Monarch series. It is a classic, big scholarly biography, full of footnotes and secondary references, trying to pin down the latest scholarship on every little detail. Not always easy to do, especially when you could easily say that the signature battle of Alfred's reign was not fought on land. And, you know, in ye olden days, the idea of getting a reliable account of a battle that was fought on the water, there's lots of other things too, lots of other aspects of Alfred's reign that if this is your way into a subject, if you look at, for instance, historical fiction and you think, no thanks, you're dropping things off and rounding things off to make a great story. I'm glad that you're doing that, but I don't trust it as history. If you're looking at a popular narrative biography and saying largely the same thing, well, you know, I appreciate that a lot of people are going to read about this subject through you, but I want the straight stuff. I don't want anyone rounding this off into a narrative in any way. I want a big, fat, authoritative, scholarly biography. If that's your way into a subject, first of all, you're a reader after my own heart, and second, you'll want this. You'll want this book before you'll want anything else. And then we'll stick with Alfred Smith here. We'll stick with Alfred Smith to end out the list. Because we'll stick with Alfred Smith, and we will go back to the primary sources. Not so much here the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. We've got an annotated version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but to Asser's life itself, which is very much susceptible to annotation. It is very much a historical document. There are all sorts of things to learn about it, regardless of what it might teach us about its subject. And Smith did an annotated scholarly edition of Asser's life, the medieval life of Alfred the Great. And you can see that Smith is being punctilious because he says the text attributed to Asser. So nobody's safe. This is if this is the way that you want. Like, for instance, if you're looking at the subject King Alfred the Great and you're saying, all right, how do we know 90% of what we know about this figure? And you'll realize right away that we know 90% of what we know about this figure from Asser's life of this figure. He was right there. He was at court. They were friends. They knew each other. Asser had many conversations with the king. You're looking at that and you're thinking, okay, well, then that's what I want to know about. That's my way into this figure, is that I want to know about that. I want to know everything there is to know about that. How reliable is that? When was that composed? What kind of access did the writer have to the subject? This is your book for that. Because this analyzes Asser's life of King Alfred to a fare thee well. So there you go. That is a starter kit, believe it or not, for King Alfred the Great. I am going to suggest in this starter kit, I sometimes remember when I give you all these choices, I sometimes remember to give you the one. If you've got the list, you've jotted it all down, you're interested in the subject, but if I'm going to start with one of these, what am I going to start with? Because, of course, my listings for starter kits aren't numbered. They aren't prioritized in terms of worth. But that question is nevertheless valid. I'm looking at this huge subject, and I don't know where to start. You've given me lots of things here, but where do I start? You start with this. You start with the Penguin Classic, Alfred the Great, which I'm hoping is still in print. I did a Daily Penguin about this. I'll leave a link to it down below. But if that's what you're looking for, where to start, you start with this. So there you go. The request of one reader, of one viewer, that is your starter kit for King Alfred the Great. And I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.